Welcome back. We're talking to Greens Senator Scott Ludlam. Well, you're known as the tech head among the Greens. We'll start with an online controversy.
Go on.
We're going to have a look at a clip that shows us what happened when a young woman in England was sort of lynched via Twitter. Her name, Caroline Criado Perez. She launched a successful campaign to have Jane Austen included on a British banknote, and in return she was on the receiving end of what somebody called this week, I thought, interestingly, radical misogyny. She received about 50 abusive tweets an hour for 12 hours, threatening to rape or kill her. Here she is.
Consciously, I'm not sort of walking around feeling really terrified, but I think underneath the surface, I think I just sort of feel under siege because it's been going on for 5 days now and it's been so relentless, and because the threats have been so graphic and people, you know, specifically saying that they're going to come and find me, and people have posted what they thought was my address online. Luckily, it wasn't my address, but, you know, the fact that they've actually tried to do that is really disturbing.
You've done a lot of work on internet privacy, and you're on the record as saying that people largely self-regulate.
Yeah.
I wonder if this doesn't show that they don't.
Well, it'll depend largely in what the outcome is. And each channel, each communications channel, throws up its own idiosyncrasies. And Twitter, for a long time, has been just considered to be anarchic. Best is just to leave it alone. And that is the way a lot of these platforms are sort of introduced to us, is it takes a while for social norms to settle down. This woman's been treated absolutely repulsively. One of the calls, which Twitter is finally getting around to implementing, is a report abuse button, much more easy to find, so that that community can better protect itself.
Well, the Australian feminist and academic Jenna Price wrote a piece for the Canberra Times this week saying that she'd had really a similar experience with an online campaign she'd had. And she wrote, "No one ever seems to take any responsibility. Not the sites where the threats are made, not the social media companies where the sites are hosted, not the police, not the government."
Yeah.
Should they take it more seriously?
Yeah.
Should they bring the sort of regulation that exists in the real world to the online world?
I think the difficulty is that these sort of interactions are quite poorly regulated in the real world, let alone how on earth you apply them to a transnational medium like Twitter. They're actually very poorly regulated. Women put up with astonishing levels of abuse in the workplace and offline, in all walks of life.
If you're dealing with a situation where someone's being psychologically abused, should you have a regulation to deal with that?
Give me an example of a regulation. I mean, what would it look like?
Well, in the same way that if I walked up to you and punched you on the nose in Martin Place, that I would be arrested. In the same way, if I psychologically abuse you, I've broken a law and I can be arrested, taken before a judge and convicted of something.
I think it's an interesting conversation that just would be formidably difficult to legislate, and along the way you're going to be creating all sorts of other unforeseen difficulties as you try and regulate that.
I mean, you're known as a libertarian, and I wonder whether it's a particular luxury for the Greens to be able to cleave to an absolute principle around freedom of speech because you are on the fringe, and in the end you're never the ones who have to do something about it.
Well, I'd like to contest nearly every part of that statement. More than 1.5 million people voted for us at the last federal election, so I'd like to contest that we're at the fringe. I don't think we are. And I don't believe speech is an absolute right. I support that woman and that community yanking at Twitter to trying to get their attention so that they could protect themselves better. Seeing the response that my colleagues Sarah Hanson-Young and Christine Milne get in their online contributions is qualitatively different to how people respond to me online.
And should they be allowed to get away with it?
What do you mean by allowed? We need to have an intelligent conversation as adults in Australia about, do you really need the state, or should we just grow up a little bit and stop treating women as though they don't belong in the public sphere?
I want to also talk to you about the power that the Greens have had in this parliament has come from holding or helping to hold the balance of power in the Senate. And it's come at a time when climate change has been front and centre of the national debate. Here's a short weather report from this week to remind us why it matters.
In Shanghai, it's absolutely sweltering. The hottest summer on record for 140 years. And earlier this month, that city had its hottest day ever. That was over 40 centigrade, 100 degrees. There has been a bit of humour in regard to this heat. Shanghai TV, one of their enterprising reporters, well, he put a slab of pork on stone and he cooked it after 10 minutes. And this has actually gone viral around the country. You're seeing pieces of pork being cooked around China and people posting the pictures of that online.
There's been so much movement, hasn't there, on action on climate change from the mainstream parties. We've seen Kevin Rudd effectively concede the carbon tax is a bad idea. He terminated it. Tony Abbott came out and said, oh, he was wrong to call climate change complete crap. The Greens, I guess, voted down Kevin Rudd's carbon pollution reduction scheme back in 2010, and here we are in 2013. We're no closer to getting one, and Tony Abbott says he'd undo the carbon tax. I mean, was that your mistake, the Greens' mistake on that issue?
Going back to 2010, if we'd voted for the CPRS, the carbon price effectively today would be about $1 a tonne, and there'd be nothing we could do about it until 2020. So we voted against it because it was bad law.
But what about the idea that you cannot let the imperfect, as Malcolm Turnbull put it, be the enemy of the possible? You know, that's what was possible. That would have allowed that mechanism in. I mean, does
it bug you at all that it wouldn't have worked at all? It's not that it was imperfect, it was that it was broken. What we have now, the Clean Energy Act, is imperfect.
And when you talk about that, you're talking about the carbon tax, which is part of that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's imperfect. That could have been a lot better. We settled for it because, A, we'd been at the negotiating table and were able to help shape it, and because it was the best you could get given the makeup of that parliament, given where the independents sat, given Greg Combet's views on coal exports and so on. That's fine. We did settle for it. It's a good example.
But I guess the real problem with the carbon tax that was revealed this week from Monash University is that it hasn't worked. I mean, it is not getting us on track to reduce carbon emissions by 5% by 2020.
I would contest that it hasn't worked. What has happened in the last 12 months, part of a longer run trend, is that renewable energy is now very quickly out-competing coal. Industry is getting more efficient. We're using less energy and we're generating it in different ways. Now, the carbon price gives you a big shunt in the right direction. So was it perfect? No. And as you acknowledged before, politics is the art of you know, settling for the imperfect. But it's a hell of a lot better than what we could have got in 2010.
And you've been involved with grassroots politics all these years. Is there a risk that people will say, you know, the Greens have been in the middle of all this and none of them have been able to come up with a perfect scheme?
Yeah.
And so I won't park my vote with the Greens. They can't do it. Nobody can do it and they can't do it either.
Well, ask me again in mid-September. I'm really proud of what we've been able to work on and achieve. It's never perfect. It's partly why I want to stick around.
Senator, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it.
Please thank Senator Ludlam. We'll be right back after the break with the dynamic Tim Rogers.